Good evening, and welcome to the Berean Coffee House. My name is Kevin Short. I'm a Christian philosopher of religion. Here we discuss faith, life, a bit of culture, all from within a Christian worldview. Why Berean? Because the Bereans believed, but they were also willing to search for truth, and Scripture claimed that they were noble as a result. Why Coffee House? Well, I enjoy coffee, and because the English Coffee House played an important role in the English and Scottish Enlightenments. So, we are going to continue today with a discussion of the aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. This was not my original plan. I'm not planning on too steady a diet of politics. Unfortunately, I cannot address this without addressing the political realities in which we live and as which we find ourselves as Christians. But there are some things that I am seeing in the reporting and the discussions and online that are concerning in the aftermath of this heinous act. So I want to start by addressing the question of anger, and I don't know that I'm the best person to make this comment. I would say Dr. Al Mohler in his briefing on Friday did a much better job than I can do, but I did want to at least voice my agreement with him that we ought to be angry and we ought to be upset at the injustice of this act. We ought to demand law enforcement to prosecute the shooter, the alleged shooter, and if he is convicted, pursue the highest possible sentence. But we do this out of a desire for justice, and we must be careful not to become vindictive and not to start making the same types of mistakes as some on the left seem to be doing. And we will discuss this later, but what we don't want is we don't want a war. We don't want people trying to take revenge by physically attacking those who would support the person who shot Charlie Kirk. That gets us nowhere. And quite frankly, we are told in the Bible that vengeance and justice ultimately are in God's hands, and justice is the role of government, beginning with the Noahic covenant, and not the role of the individual or of the church. So I would agree with Dr. Mohler there, and I did want to begin with a statement of that. Something else that is associated with Charlie Kirk right now that I am seeing some on the right espouse and I am seeing some on the left categorically reject is the claim that Charlie Kirk is a martyr. Is Charlie Kirk a martyr? I would have to say yes, absolutely. Part of why he was killed was because he upheld Christian values. He upheld the teachings of Jesus. He upheld the teachings of the Old and the New Testament. And we must view both as inspired. Now, was this the only reason why he was killed? No. Is he a Christian nationalist? I don't think so. We can go on and on and on. There are a lot of things he wasn't, but I do think it is fair to say he is a martyr for the faith. And he ought to be viewed as a hero as such. Though as a Christian, I don't believe we worship martyrs. I do believe they set an important and positive example for us. The third thing that I think we need to note, and especially for anybody who might be watching this from the left, though I don't think you'll watch very long, is that this shooting is different for a lot of reasons. It is different because Charlie Kirk was not a politician. We have unfortunately seen a lot of political violence, but it's not typically addressed at commentators. It's usually leveled at political figures. We've seen senators, we've seen state representatives, we've seen governors threatened, but we don't generally associate attempts to assassinate people with someone who is going around to colleges and frankly debating with people. That is a very clear difference, and as I said in my previous video, this is why this is such an important issue. Because this attack on Charlie Kirk is ultimately an attack on the social contract itself. And I would say the same thing if this was an attack on a left-wing commentator. Because the social contract, the entire point is to avoid violence and to focus instead on debate and discussion. But what also hits personally is not just that Charlie Kirk had a lot of fans, but a lot of people in government viewed him personally as a friend. And that is going to have a chilling effect on what comes next, unfortunately. Now, the second thing I want to talk about are issues of culpability. Because we are seeing some dangerous moves by the left to try and claim that the alleged shooter is actually a conservative. Now, I don't want to get into statistics of who does or who commits the most political violence. There are a lot of problems, I think, with most of those discussions. These include, where do we get our information from for compiling these statistics? Because there are some groups that the left will not want to gather information from, and there are some groups I'm not going to accept. So, for example, I generally do not consider the Southern Poverty Law Center, which compiles a lot of data on this type of thing, to be a reliable organ. I reject them out of hand. I do not consider them, in philosophical terms, I do not consider them to be a good epistemic agent. There is, in my opinion, some history of deception in the way they have handled a number of different issues. And because of that, I don't use them as a source. There are questions about how we define conservative. Because conservative for example, in Europe, the term conservative and the term as it has traditionally been used in the United States and the way it has been used in the past 10 years since Donald Trump have come onto the scene are very different. Traditionally, an American conservative was somebody who held to classical liberalism. Now, why are they called conservatives in the American usage? Because our Constitution was written within the spirit of classical liberalism, and that is what American conservatives traditionally were trying to conserve. Conservatives on the continent, on the other hand, would tend to view the ends of the spectrum as being fascists on the one side and communists on the other. Within the American usage and within American history, fascists and communists have both influenced traditional progressives in the teens and 20s and 30s. And so even the way we define these things is going to be different. And Trump has completely shaken this up. And I'm quite frankly not even sure how the term conservative is being used in the age of Trump, because it matches nothing I can think of or see or grasp very well. So we need to be very careful in how we gather statistical information and how we look at statistical information, because we may not even have an identical definition of what is right-wing and what is left-wing. But while there are problems here, we do need to acknowledge that there is a very credible threat from both the extreme right and the extreme left. In some cases, we may not always know who's involved in something. In some cases, you can't even go by party. Senator Gifford was shot, but she was not shot by a Republican or a MAGA type. She was shot by somebody who was to the left of her. The Minnesota shooter who shot two of the state representatives in Minnesota does not appear to have been a part of MAGA or a Trumpist. And it appears the motives, from what I have seen from interviews with the alleged shooters, would probably be local and state issues. And the man himself had ties to the state's Democratic apparatus and was appointed to posts by a Democratic governor. But What conservatives can't dismiss is the attack on Paul Pelosi, because that was somebody who was deeply entrenched with MAGA viewpoints. But in this situation, and in the two situations associated with President Trump, we probably are talking about somebody on the far left. In this case, we know that this person's bullet cases had terms that were buzzwords for Antifa, a far left organization. His family has stated that he had taken on far left and extreme left positions. And one of, and perhaps the most troubling statement that I have seen from the bullet cases is a reference to a song that was an anti-fascist anthem in Italy, which is very troubling because there is a lot of propaganda from Marxism that is endemic in what is considered anti-fascism in the European theater. So I think it's dangerous to try and back away and try and say that somehow one side or the other has a monopoly on violence. And quite frankly, the question is in politics is not which side is more violent. It doesn't matter. Violence in our politics is unacceptable. It is always unacceptable at this stage and time, as long as we are a functioning democracy, and we still seem to be one. But another aspect of culpability that I think is getting missed is what I would call the dangers of our rhetoric. And usually we are still seeing this discussed only in terms of the rhetoric of a Charlie Kirk or of a Donald Trump. I want to go back for a moment to January 6th. In the January 6th riot, I do not believe it is appropriate to describe it as an insurrection. I do believe it is a riot. But Donald Trump's former Attorney General quoted at the time that he felt Trump had moral, but not necessarily legal culpability in bringing that about. That is, it is very difficult to say that Donald Trump, according to Mr. Barr, had legal culpability for incitement, because some of the requirements for that charge are not met without a bit of, shall we say, very creative work by lawyers, which is one of the problems I have with the aspects of lawfare that were going on during the last election. But I do think discussions that were probably false, implying that Donald Trump actually won the election, something I do not believe happened, did contribute to that riot. Let's say for a moment that there was a service station that was storing gasoline in gas cans in a basement someplace. And they weren't properly ventilating it. They weren't properly trying to make sure that everything was up to code. And then an arsonist comes by and starts a fire, and there's a huge explosion. Who's culpable for that? Ultimately, the arsonist. However, the improper storage of gasoline contributed to the end result. Donald Trump's rhetoric in the lead up to January 6th contributed, much like the gas example, to creating an emotional tenor that made January the 6th possible. So while I don't believe January the 6th was an insurrection, and I don't agree with politicizing it, I also don't take it lightly. Now let's move this for a moment from Trump to the American left. The left uses the term fascist, the term Nazi, and the term Hitler in a manner that is just as reckless as what Trump was saying about the stolen election. Are American conservatives, are Trumpists fascists? No. And if somebody thinks they're fascist, they either don't know history very well, or there's some mental instability, or something. But these individuals are not fascists. And yet, when you begin labeling them as such, when you begin using these terms so freely, then what you are doing is you are storing that rhetorical gasoline, just waiting for an unstable individual to snap and become that arsonist that sets off a massive explosion. So is the left as a whole culpable for the death of Charlie Kirk? I would say in the same sense as conspiracy theorists were in the lead up to January the 6th. And I realize for many of my leftist friends, that may be hard to swallow. But it is medicine you have to swallow. Because if you don't, you can't be healed of it. And we can't be healed of it. And the country can't fix it. In part, this, again, comes from communist and neo-Marxist groups. During the Cold War, the term fascist was often used in this same light type of manner. And it is used that way in neo-Marxist writings. Most importantly, in discussions by someone like Herbert Marcuse in the United States, which can particularly be seen in something such as his essay, Repressive Tolerance. And we really need to exercise far greater care in how these two terms are used. There is an old ethical experiment, an old ethical discussion. If you could go back in time and kill Hitler before the rise of the Third Reich, would it be moral to do so? And the answer for many people is yes. And so when you start comparing Trump to Hitler, when you start comparing MAGA to Nazis or MAGAs to fascists, you are essentially saying it is reasonable to assassinate these people beforehand. And that is not a reasonable outcome. And once again, it is to misuse the ideas of fascism and nationalism. And even these terms can be highly charged in the way we define them. What is a nationalist? Some people would define a nationalist as someone who believes that a government's first responsibility is to its citizens and its territory. I don't consider that unreasonable. In fact, I would agree with that idea. Does that make me a nationalist? Not in the sense that most Europeans seem to think that it does, because I don't necessarily think that nationalism needs to be handled at the expense of other nations. It merely means that we do not make deals that are solely made at our own expense. So, even here, the dice can be a little bit loaded. Is there a solution to this problem? I think there is. I don't know if anybody's willing to do it. I think we need to start treating an accusation of someone being a Nazi or a fascist as defamation per se. Now, let me go back a little bit and discuss the history of these terms. For a long time, this was a common thing in our political rhetoric. But people didn't take it seriously. Today, people take it seriously. And as a result, being called a Nazi or being called a fascist can have long-term consequences for the individual that is so labeled. And the proper remedy for these problems is a defamation lawsuit. Defamation per se is a little bit different from other types of defamation because you don't necessarily have to prove specifics in terms of damages. Now, it doesn't mean damages are automatic, but if proved, you don't have to demonstrate every potential financial loss, every potential issue of pain and suffering, etc. Very much like a current case going on, sometimes called the TikTok psychic case, of a psychic who accused a history teacher at the University of Idaho of being behind the murder of the Idaho Four. And this professor sued the psychic, and it is going forward in court now on damages alone because it was found to be defamation without any factual contradictions, to be defamation per se. So nothing had to be demonstrated beyond that point, and now it is just a point of how much the damages are, which can be zero, instead of whether defamation itself happened. We need to reserve these terms, as serious as they are, for only those who are actually members of a Nazi party or something like it, and not as just this blanket term that's used to describe anybody to the right of Stalin, Lenin, Marx, or Trotsky. And that is, quite frankly, the definition that is being used by groups like Antifa. And one thing to note with Antifa, ironically, is they act far more like the historical fascists than their opponents do. Now, there's a third concern, and I think it's a very important one to discuss, and that is this assassination and freedom of speech. And this is going to be the last concern that I'm going to address, but it's also the most important. Now, before I go on, especially since I just discussed defamation, I think it's important to note what the definition of speech is in terms of freedom of speech. The way I'm defining speech, and it should not be that controversial, is the right to express an opinion or belief, or to make an argument for a position. This is different from, say, pornographic material, which appeals to the glands rather than to the mind. There must be an intellectual component for it to actually be speech. You are not merely trying to communicate an emotion, you are trying to communicate an idea. There are responsibilities that come with speech. This is why defamation is a thing. Defamation deals not with criminalizing speech we dislike, but it does require individuals to be accountable for the impact that their speech has. So if I say something and it gets that person fired, I say about, my buddy John, that John is a thief, and he is not a thief, but he gets fired anyway because of what I said, then he has the right under the law to sue me for the damages he received from the lie I told. And so defamation does not criminalize speech, it does not end speech, but it does require us to be properly responsible for the damages, the actual damages that our statements inflict. And I don't mean these modern ideas of pain and suffering because I said something somebody doesn't like. We are seeing reports that people are being fired for statements they've made about Charlie Kirk's assassination. There's a lot of irony in this, because many of those who have complained about people being fired for making statements about Charlie Kirk were the same individuals that 6 months or a year ago were trying to get people fired for statements that they deemed racist. Whether they were or not is up for debate in many cases. And were involved in cancel culture. So it is rather ironic that their own weapon is being used against them. And this, incidentally, is my view of why Trumpism can be dangerous. Because the way I view Donald Trump is that he has taken the left wing's playbook and used it against them. And I do not consider that to be a good thing, because I consider the left's playbook in and of itself to be dangerous to our culture and to be dangerous to the American way of life. So there's some irony in what is happening here. There's also a bit of deceit. Some of the articles I have seen, including one that involves a DC comic book artist who had drawn a recent Batman-affiliated comic book, stated that the person had been fired as if this was a horrible thing, and is almost implied that she was just saying she wasn't a fan of he or she. I'm not sure. I know the person is trans. I don't know what their real gender is, which is not the gender they are transitioning to, but that which they were born with, but that's a discussion for later. But this individual was not merely making a statement that they thought Kirk was hateful. They were making a statement that they were very proud of the bullet, that they hoped the bullet wasn't harmed, etc., etc. So they were actually expressing, this person was actually expressing a desire for violence. And that is crossing an important line in many ways. But I'm not sure I'm always in favor of these firings, and I don't want us to start doing what the left has been doing and trying to create witch hunts to get rid of leftists. That also damages the social contract, and it damages freedom of speech. But I do think we need to discuss this with a certain bit of nuance that gets left out of this discussion in general. First of all, why is it dangerous? The answer is because the purpose of freedom of speech is to remove the use of force, and that allows us to rely instead on the force of argument. And the use of economic force is not really that different from the use of military force. So if you try and starve an idea out by firing anybody who holds to it, you're really not doing that much different than if the military were to go in and burn those individuals' fields so they couldn't eat. Or if they were imprisoning them, or something like that. It has the same chilling impact on speech. But I think there are some exceptions to this discussion of market forces. And I'm going to give you what I consider to be two very important ones. The first are those who are in areas of public trust. And one of the examples of somebody who was fired, and I don't know precisely what was said in this case, but allegedly a Secret Service agent was let go or was suspended and is being reviewed because of some comments they made about the Charlie Kirk assassination. And many people have jumped up and said this firing is unjust. Is it? Well, what is the Secret Service's job? Their job is to prevent political assassinations of certain key individuals within the government. If someone expresses pro-political assassination views, that implies this is a person who should not be in this specific position of trust. Not because of their political positions, not because they differ from the current president, but because they don't seem to view political assassination as in and of itself wrong and something to be avoided. it is dangerous to put them in a position of trust. I would argue the same thing is true for teachers in a public school. Now, private schools, I think, are a little bit different. Discuss that in a few minutes. But public school teachers in public universities are in a similar position of trust. And if somebody is exercising a position that is so extreme as to advocate political violence, then you have to start asking, are they going to be reasonably fair with students who disagree with them? Are they going to allow students to disagree with them? One of the very real problems with discussions of academic freedom in this country is that academic freedom only applies to professors, but it doesn't actually apply to the students. And it seems to me that is a problem. Of course, our ideas of academic freedom come from fascist societies and from totalitarian societies, particularly from Germany and Prussia before it became Germany. And those ideas were to give academics freedom in a society that was generally not free. And so it makes sense in that context. Many of the discussions of academic freedom in our context don't make the same type of sense and can't be applied in the same way. Now, I'm not arguing for a firing of academics who disagree with me. I'm just noting it is not the same thing. And there is good reason, I think, for teachers and professors to be removed in these cases. Because it is a mark or it is an indication that somebody is going to be discriminatory in the way they handle the authority and the trust they are given. But I think we need to be careful not to go on a witch hunt and start extending this into areas where it's not an issue. I'm not that worried about a musician. I'm not that worried about an author who makes these kinds of comments. The second area where I think an exception belongs are in areas where there is a mission statement in an organization and the comments and statements are being made are at odds with that organization's mission statement. Churches, I think, are the classic example, and Christian schools are the classic example of this. A Christian school's mission statement involves the advancement of the Christian worldview and an advancement of Christianity and teaching younger people the faith and helping them to grow up into fully formed Christian adults. And therefore, it is appropriate for a Christian school to make sure its teachers have made some statement of faith and to sign a statement of faith. The same thing goes for Christian universities. Now, some people will immediately say, I've just discounted free speech. No, because free speech doesn't require me to subsidize your speech. And it does not require that all forums are open to all speech. What it requires is that all speech has a place it can take place. There is nothing about a Baptist seminary existing and having a conversation from within a Christian and a Baptist worldview that prevents a Methodist or a Muslim or a naturalist from having their own forums and building their own platforms. This, by the way, is why I say many of the issues we have with tech companies are not issues ultimately of freedom of speech. They are issues of monopoly. When you have a small number of companies that can control the entire marketplace of ideas, you have a monopoly and that needs to end. But that is not the same thing as making an argument on freedom of speech. I view freedom of speech less as a single market and more like a mall. What do I mean by that? Well, you don't complain when you go to Levi Strauss and find they don't have Ralph Lauren suit jackets. Why? Because they are specialized in denim. And if you want to go to a place like Sears that carries suits and denim, great. If you want to go someplace that's a little more specialized, great. One of the advantages of my view is quite frankly, there are some things that it's difficult to teach unless you have the foundational claims, the foundational basis, pretty well ironed out ahead of time. It's rather difficult to teach systematic theology in a setting in which you have people who don't hold to the faith at all, who then want to interrupt on something that prevents you from being able to dig deeper than you can on just the surface level. So there are areas where I think it's reasonable to let somebody go if it conflicts with your mission statement. But in many cases, I'm not sure this is what's happening. And I do think we need to avoid a Christian version or a conservative version of cancel culture. There are platforms where I think it is unreasonable to allow leftists to speak. For example, I would not want a leftist speaking at our church and trying to push democratic policies, or making a pro-abortion argument from our pastor's pulpit. That would be inappropriate and sacrilegious and contrary to our statement of faith. But I don't want to suppress their ability to make their points in their forms. And we risk the danger of crossing that line. Here, however, is one counterpoint. An outcry. Somebody who says, hey, that is vicious, and those statements you made are not okay, is not chilling to free speech. Why? Because you are exercising your own speech. And now the point is open for debate. So while we should avoid trying to get people fired, we also should not say that it is wrong to react or to respond to over-the-top statements in favor of political assassination. Before we leave, I've mentioned 3 areas of concern, but I want to note, besides my discussion of defamation, some things that are necessary for us to move forward. And really, the first one is the most important, and that's the need to unplug. Outside of a 4 to 6 month period before an election, I don't pay a lot of attention to politics. I used to. I used to be a very political animal. The only politics I pay attention to, for the most part, are political theorists and political philosophers. So, John Rawls, or Marx, or someone like that. I'll read their works. But I don't spend a lot of time on partisanship. I don't spend a lot of time on what is happening today. I don't spend a lot of time on news, and I don't spend a lot of time on political commentary. In fact, I generally avoid the news. About the only news I get on a regular basis is Al Mohler's The Briefing. And if you don't listen to Dr. Mohler's Briefing, I would encourage you to do so. It is a great blessing, and it is a great help. Agree with him or disagree with him. But I don't spend a lot of time on Fox News. I used to. I stopped listening. I used to listen to both Fox and CNN. I stopped listening to CNN after the Mueller report came out, and the entire Russia conspiracy hoax was proven to be a conspiracy hoax, and despite the attempts to revive it. And CNN refused to apologize or take that necessary circumspect moment to ask why they had the story wrong, why they missed it. I stopped watching CNN at that point because they were dishonest. They were not reasonable. They were gung-ho to protect their image and to put forward their message rather than to proclaim truth. When Fox News started putting people on who had claimed that Trump's election was stolen, and when they started putting QAnon figures onto their broadcasts, that was when I stopped watching Fox. We have come to a point where the mainstream media is no longer reliable. And many other types of media, such as what you find on YouTube, are going to be even less reliable because there's no standards for quality there. And so I generally wait on news and only deal with it when I find out something big is happening from some other place. And then I'm as likely to get it from Fox, CNN, the AP, and other places. And I'm also very patient. I never believe a story when it first comes out. Because, unfortunately, we live in a day where if you're a news outlet, it's more important to be first than to be right. And oftentimes, the first version of a story misses important points. And so I'm always slow to form opinions on many, many issues. So the first thing I think we need to do is unplug. The second thing we need is what we might call a gentleman's agreement between the two parties. I don't mean suspension of freedom of speech or anything like that. I just mean that both parties need to have a real discussion with each other to develop some reasonable rules of the road for discourse. And part of this means that the Democrats need to call out the far left, and the Republicans need to call out the far right. Republicans need to distance themselves from anybody on the right who advocates the use of violence, anybody on the right who advocates Nazism, racism, or something like that. And the Democrats need to do the same with anybody who is a Marxist. And I think that's the only way to move forward, because Republicans responding to Marxists and Democrats responding to racists, quite frankly, doesn't seem to get us very far. It just gets everybody screaming at each other. We need to more carefully use words like Marxist, woke, communist, Nazi, fascist. And we need to prevent these terms from being misused the way they are. Again, I don't mean by suspending freedom of speech, but I mean by the platforms of the two major parties to focus on the more reasonable elements within their parties and get back to substantive debates rather than gotcha moments. And the third thing that I think we need to consider, and this is the one I hope we don't have to take, is to set up a method for state secessions. And the reason why I say that is because I don't believe we are in a situation where a civil war would be just. It would not fit into my views of just war theory. But if we are at such a point where there is an intractable left and an intractable right, and the foundational basis of these two parties is so far apart that no agreement and no compromise can be made. And compromise is an important thing in any social contract system. Then a national divorce is a better option than a civil war. But making a path to secession needs to be thought out ahead of time, because there are a lot of issues and particular points that would need to be dealt with for secession to be a possibility. Let's say California voted to secede tomorrow, something they threatened to do. Or let's say Texas were to plan to secede tomorrow, something they've been threatening to do since about the day after they became a state. What happens? What happens to that state's share of the per capita national debt? What happens to military assets based within those states? What happens to their share and taxpayer-based inheritance from military assets in other states? What about land and property and other things that are owned by somebody outside of that state. These are all important discussions. They are important issues. What about somebody who doesn't want to live in the seceding state? They want to leave. They basically say, hey, California or Texas is leaving. I want to maintain my U.S. citizenship. How's that going to be handled? All of these discussions would need to take place for a viable plan for secession to happen. And I would hope a national divorce is not necessary. I think the U.S. is stronger as a whole. However, as I said, I think it is something that has to be on the table because a national divorce is certainly preferable to another civil war. And if the temperature does not cool down, that is precisely where we are headed. And so those are the three things that I personally think as believers we should be looking out for. I realize this has been a little bit long. If you've stayed with me the whole time, I thank you. If you find anything I've said helpful, please like and subscribe. If you don't like it, please let me know that. You can let me know in the comments. As always, you can also contact me at Berean Coffee House at gmail.com. And I hope you have a good evening and a good night, and please stay safe. Thank you.